What's up, everybody? I'm Phil Perry. Welcome into the Next Pats podcast. We have one of our all-time favorite guests here on Next Pats with us this week. It's throwing coach to the stars, Tom House. You know him as Tom Brady's throwing coach. He's also worked with Drew Brees. He's worked with baseball guys, Nolan Ryan, Randy Johnson. He's a baseball guy himself. He pitched for the Red Sox. For those listeners that may remember him back in the 70s here in Boston. But now, the reason why we're interviewing him is because he's also working with Mac Jones. They worked together on several different occasions over the course of this offseason, as you'll hear him explain. And we had him on around this time last year to get his take on Mac Jones's mechanics, if you remember. And I'll tweet out this link for those of you that may have missed it or maybe just forgotten. We went over some practice video of Mac Jones. And we talked about his follow through and his back leg being almost a little bit like a bowler's back leg and how it swung up behind him in a certain way. And he liked his mechanics then, but wasn't as though those things were completely refined. And so there was plenty for Mac Jones and Tom House to work on together when it comes to how you throw the football, but then how far you can throw the football and your velocity throwing the football. And there were certain things that we couldn't get into with Tom House because he and Mac Jones have this relationship now. So you won't hear us talk about drills. You won't hear us talk about specific numbers that they were able to get to in their time together, whether it's velocity or yardage even necessarily. But you will hear him talk about the process of working with Mac Jones, what it's like trying to rein in someone who's as competitive as Mac Jones. And I think that will interest listeners, is hearing just what he thinks of Mac Jones's intensity and his approach to practice, especially given the people that he's worked with. Some of the best, not just players and talents that we've seen, but some of the best competitors that we've seen across different sports. And for Mac Jones to stand out in the way that he did to Tom House, and I understand there's a client relationship there, and Mac Jones is paying to work with Tom House to be able to get some of the insights that he would get from Tom Brady's throwing coach. But to hear Tom House describe Mac Jones in the way that he does, understanding the level of athlete that he's accustomed to working with, I think that will stand out to listeners. And that should get listeners excited, especially when you hear not only the competitiveness portion of our conversation, but when you hear Tom House describe just how smart he believes Mac Jones is. Because again, he worked with some pretty smart players over the years, including friend of the podcast, Matt Castle, by the way. Castle's the one who initially introduced Tom House to Tom Brady. We talked about that backstory before, but if you remember, this is not our first time talking with Tom House about Mac Jones. We had him on the podcast around this time last year. We talked about practice tape that we had to show Tom House and what he thought of Mac Jones's mechanics. They weren't perfect then. We talked about the bowler's back leg. He liked a lot of things that he saw from Mac Jones, but surely there were things for Mac and House to work on together this offseason in their time together. So plenty to get to with Tom House. We're going to talk about his Mustard app, which for the parents out there that are listening to the podcast that have kids that are throwers, baseball, football, whatever, this is a phenomenal resource for you. And so we'll hear him describe exactly what that resource entails. MSTRD.com for information on that. But you'll hear him talk about Mustard, and then we will get into our conversation about the Patriots quarterback. So without further ado, here's Tom House. All right, there he is, Tom House, one of our favorite guests, friend of the Next Pats podcast. We've spoken to him on the Patriots Talk podcast as well. Tom, thanks so much for being with us again here.
It's my pleasure, Phil. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday to you. I want to, before we launch into our football-specific discussion, I would love to get you to talk a little bit about Mustard. And I think this is one of the best values in youth sports right now. Everything that you're doing for families and helping kids, you know, I think probably have a lot more fun by understanding how to improve. So tell us a little bit about Mustard for our listeners who maybe don't know about it right now.
Well, thanks, Phil. I really appreciate the setup on this. Mustard is probably, as I look back, it's probably one of the best things that I've been involved with. And you and I have talked off camera. You know what I do. Well, when I'm physically in front of an athlete, um, it's pretty intense. It's elite and it's very expensive. Well, what Mustard is, we're trying to democratize. And remember, I'm using big words like I know what they all mean, but we're trying to democratize what we do in person with the elite athletes, where not very many people in the world can afford it or have access to it. Not just myself, but the people that are around me. We've actually put it on a cell phone to where a mom and a dad of a 12-year-old can film their daughter or their son in the backyard, shoot it to the cloud, and get virtually the same motion analysis, the same efficacy as our elite guys do when they come to the labs that we have around the country for 3D capture. So again, what we're trying to do is make it affordable, because the numbers that scare us in our research, there's like 140 million pre-adolescent athletes around the world, 80% of which will stop playing by the time they're 14 years old because they're not having fun, they don't have access to good coaching, and they just can't really get the motivation to play. And the power of play in sports are huge, especially in today's world. So Mustard is our attempt at putting it in the hands of everybody so that the kids will at least play sports a little longer. And I know I'm getting long-winded here, but the research shows if a kid can play sports through high school, it helps their mental emotional development, helps their physical development, and they come out the other end. Even if they don't play in college or pro ball, they'll come out the other end a better person for the experience. So long story short, or short story long, that's what Mustard is all about.
Well, it's just so amazing for, again, these families to have access to you and to all the technology that I know that you use to help the athletes that you work with, and for it to be as easy as shooting a video on your cell phone, which is something that we all do as parents, as young as these kids are, the first time they dribble a basketball or throw a ball in the backyard, we're capturing that on video anyway, to be able to send you that and get some real constructive feedback to help them enjoy the sport long term. There's so much value to that for parents.
That's dead on. That observation was perfect. And the really cool thing, the research we're getting is these 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, they pick it up as quick as the big boys do. So it's good all the way around.
It's great. And so for people who want to learn more about Mustard, Tom, it's MSTRD.com, right? That's the best place for them to go.
It's really simple, and it's all free. The idea is we want to get it in front of as many kids as we can, and have the parents understand it's not just by guess and by golly. This is the exact same information and instruction the big boys get. All right. And down the line, when they are ready to make their $1 million a month, they're more than welcome to come by and write the big check. It all works out perfect that way.
That's a great system in place, and you're segueing perfectly for us. You should be in the Tom House podcast business with us here. We'd love to have you on all the time, even more than we already do, Tom.
Be so careful what you ask. You might get in trouble with that one, but let's just bang away. I always have fun hanging out with you guys, so I hope I can answer your questions and have a little fun while we're doing it.
We're going to get you on the payroll. Don't you worry about it before this conversation's over, Tom. Let's talk about one of those big boys, though, that you mentioned, because we talked to you about this time last year. It was actually probably closer to about a month into Mac Jones's rookie season. And our podcast here, Next Pats, we're always sort of trying to focus on, it's obvious, but what's next for the roster, for the team. Sometimes we'll take big picture views at the league in general. But as you can imagine, with a young quarterback being at the center of things here, a lot of our episodes have centered around Mac Jones. And so our listeners love hearing about him, hearing about his progress. And we actually talked to him this summer, and he was asked if he had spent some time with you. I think there had been some nuggets on social media that you two had spent some time together, and he confirmed that he had. And so I just wanted to ask you, what was it like spending a little bit of time with Mac Jones? Because the last time we spoke to you, I'm not sure the two of you had met or spent much time together.
Well, as it turned out, precipitous is, I guess, a big word. Um, he made the call, and we got together during the summer. I've actually seen him 2 or 3 times since we last talked, and I think the Patriot fans realize they got a quarterback that, between the ears, he's way more experienced than what it actually shows age-wise. And if anything, he was a little short on some physical things. Mechanics were okay, but nothing special. And what we found out with his hard work, um, he's actually matching up his physical and his mental emotional. And that combination is going to make for a fun time for the fans of the Patriots this whole season. I'm going to make that early prediction. And I think Coach Belichick has already noticed there's a lot of improvement physically from a year ago. And it's not just his stature, but his throwing mechanics, his footwork, to go with what's between his ears. It could be kind of special this season.
Well, it's been so interesting to listen to you over the years, and I've tried to pick up little nuggets from you whenever I can, whether it's, we're talking about Tom Brady or just throwing it in general. And one of the things that I know you're very high on is the fact that these guys, even though they are professional athletes, Max in his second year as a pro here, there's still plenty of room for him to develop. And you've talked about the windows of trainability, how there are 4 of those. You start with the nerve, then there's the muscle, the skill acquisition, and the skill retention. I remember those from a previous conversation. Where is Mac Jones in terms of, being somebody who obviously is at, playing at a very high level for someone his age? And, he ends up having one of the best statistical rookie seasons that we've seen, relative to most over the course of the last however many years in the NFL. But where is he right now, and how much room do you think he has to grow?
Well, the sky's the limit with this young man. You hit the 4 basics. When an athlete comes to us for throwing mechanics, he's also going to get functional strength training. He's also going to get mental emotional tricks, and he's going to look at sleep and nutrition for recovery. And when you talk about the windows of trainability, here's a young man that is just at the beginning of his skill acquisition window, which is age 19, 20 until age 34, 35. So if you just did the math, he's got to be 25 right now, 26? He's got another 8, 10 years of improvement ahead of him. And how much he improves, obviously, is up to him. But what I see with these elite guys, they try to get a little bit better every day. Not 20% better today, but like 1%, 2%. And that's what you see when you work with and hang out with Mac. You're looking at a young man that is trying to get better at something every stinking day. And the net result will be that what was a question mark about how well would he throw down the line, it's getting better every day because he's working at it. Obviously, our research tells us what he needs to work on based on his motion analysis. And then we have what we call a deliverable, or a way to fix. And nobody has a better work ethic than this young man. In fact, we have to talk about sometimes less is more. He's a young man, if you tell him he needs to do 100 reps of something, he'll give you 200 reps. So we're always trying to make sure in his mind that it's nice to work hard, but you don't want to overwork. So we're balancing all those things off. Net result, he's a better quarterback than he was a year ago, and he should get better every year until 35, 36. Will he be a Tom Brady and still producing at age 45? Don't know, but it doesn't mean he can't. Did that make sense?
No question. I know, Tom Brady is a unicorn, but he is still a human being. And we've seen you work with others. Nolan Ryan is the one who comes to mind first and foremost, who have been able to perform at elite levels well beyond what most people expected. So who knows where Mac Jones's career ends up going. I think the thing that Patriots fans look at now, Tom, and we've only seen a limited sample size in terms of what the preseason has to offer, but I think a lot of people are wondering, okay, has his arm gotten stronger? Is there anything that you've seen this summer, whether it's even just maybe working with him in the time that you've worked with him, but especially through August here as he's getting ready for the season where you've looked at him and said, I'm not sure he would have been able to make that throw even a year ago?
Well, you're very observant. Not only is he better, not only has he improved his throwing efficiency, he's gotten stronger functionally. So if you're improving your mechanics and you're improving your functional strength, the net result in performance he should throw the ball more efficiently longer. He should have more accuracy. He should have more spin rate. All the metrics that you actually identify and measure a kid with, he's checking all the boxes for me.
Tom, I would love to share my screen with you here and just watch a couple throws from their last preseason game, the Patriots' last preseason game, if that's okay with you, because one of the cool things about watching this last preseason game was we got to see him throw on the run a little bit. And so that's one thing that I think people, when they look at, Mac Jones and where he might be going, and in terms of the arm strength, I think they say, well, is he going to be able to throw off platform? And we're seeing it here. And that looks like a pretty good off-platform throw to me, but I'm the layman. What does the throwing coach say?
Well, what you look at when they're throwing on the run, especially when he's throwing to his right, his throwing side, watch his legs as he throws. You'll see a little scissor kick. That's the same thing that a water polo, when a water polo guy throws the ball in the water, he'll scissor his legs to get the energy into his torso and not into his arm. So if we were just practicing and I saw that throw from Mac, he'd get a Yahoo, nice going, and a hand clap from me, because it was actually perfect. Without giving away secrets, it also shows what his torque capacity is. And you'll notice his head doesn't stink and move. His eyes remain level. So if I'm evaluating that throw on the run, that's a plus across the board. So give me something where he screws up so I have something to teach.
Well, listen, I don't know if this is going to be deemed a screw up for you, but I will give you something else here. This was a throw where he does try to push it down the field. This is a throw from the pocket. But he gets hit here, Tom, and and anybody that's watching the NFL understands that it's just so rare to have a clean pocket all the time, to be able to mechanically do everything that it is that you want to do to execute the perfect throw. And so we saw a couple times in this game. There was another throw that he had to try to make with Cole Strange, his rookie left guard, basically in his lap, and he can't follow through. I'm not sure he was even really able to step into that thing. But I'm sure some of what your work includes is when you can't do everything the right way, when you can't hit all of those steps that you would love for them to hit. I remember when we spoke last year, you talked a lot about dragging your back foot until the ball is out. Maybe that still is possible. You're the expert. You have the much better eyes than I do when it comes to this, but it feels like this is maybe one of those throws where he could get through most of it, but maybe not all of it, because he does get hit at the end here. So I'll show you this one.
Sure. Now, while we're doing this, remember, he only has X amount of time, and experience will have him. There's a clock in their head. You hear announcers talking about it all the time. There's a clock in your head that you've got to get rid of the ball. So if anything, I'll guarantee if he didn't see with his peripheral vision that the guy was coming from his right side, he felt him. And that's where you have to abbreviate. In a perfect world, you go feet to fingertips with the energy translation. He had to speed things up a little bit because he had run out of time. And that's where functional strength comes in. And I'd give him a plus. If you watch, he did have to move his head a little bit to get caught. Now watch his head move to the left just a notch. And that tells me that he was a little out of sequence with his timing. He had to quote, quote, rush his throw. If he didn't, he would have probably, it would have been either a fumble or right there. You see, I had to move his head to generate arm speed to get rid of the ball. That was actually, he's in survival mode there, and he had to give up on perfect and just get the ball advanced. I don't know where the pass went, but I'm guessing it was high and away.
Exactly right. It ended up a little high and away from the receiver, Devontae Parker, along the boundary there.
Yeah, and the reason we know that, for every 1 inch of inappropriate head movement, it costs you 2 inches of release point. And he lost his perfect release point because he had to cheat with his body to get rid of that ball on time. Maybe last year the same thing, might have been a sack or a fumble. So again, with experience, and that's the one thing you can't teach, he's going to have to learn when he's running out of time to be as efficient as he can. And maybe later on in the game, that same timing, he may have hit the receiver perfectly. But until he experiences all that stuff, all we can do is talk about it.
Well, and he does seem like, just having had the chance to talk to him a few times this offseason, and he's been on Next Pats as well with us, and we've had some great conversations over the last 6 months or so. I know he is really intense about his job and about trying to improve and getting to where he wants to be. And you referenced this a little bit earlier, that maybe there are times he wants to do a little bit too much. And those of us listening to you now, Tom, and those of us that have heard you on our podcast or others before, you just sound like such a laid back, calm. I don't know if it's the San Diego lifestyle or what it is, but is it difficult at times to work with these high level people that you're working with and get them to dial back in order for them to take the proper steps forward sometimes?
Well, the really cool thing about dealing with athletes from 12 years old until 45 years old is they're all just terminal adolescents. Tom Brady at 45 is still really only 12. And Mac Jones may appear to be much more experienced and, level-headed than his age would dictate, but he's a big 12-year-old also. And what we found, if you as an instructor have information and instruction and you can communicate it properly, all these guys are really fun to work with. And they're kinesthetically blessed. With most of them, you show them once or twice, they got it, and then they just go home and work on it. And Mac is one of those guys that he'll ask questions. I don't know what kind of a student he was at Alabama, but as a football player, he's up there with one of the smartest kids I've ever worked with. And you mix what's between his ears, and you see his body getting better also. That's a great combination.
Yeah, he had an excellent academic career, I know, at Alabama. And so maybe no surprise that some of those skills have translated to his job right now. I find it so fascinating to talk to you, Tom, because not only do you have everything that you do with these guys on the field, in the lab, so to speak, but you do talk about the mental, emotional at times too. And that's something that I think we associate, maybe more sports fans these days associate more with baseball and, maybe with pitchers or, hitters that are working through a slump. But I'm sure it applies across sports because these guys are all dealing with different things on the field, how their brains and their emotions react to certain events that are happening in real time. And so is that something that you will work on even with somebody at Mac Jones's level? It's not just about
Yes.
the younger athletes, it's about these guys that are adults as well.
You're spot on with that. Remember I said earlier, they come from mechanics. They're going to get mental, emotional, as well as nutrition and sleep and functional strength. And everybody processes differently to get a throw or a handoff or read a defense, whatever it might be. But quarterbacks, in my opinion, have to process more data quicker than any other sport that's out there. Maybe hockey. Pitchers pretty much have as much time as they need to process. Quarterbacks, they go, I'm kind of guessing, I don't know for a fact, but they're going to the line with a play that's been called, when they can check off to, and then depending on what the defense shows, they can make a couple other adjustments at the line. So by combinations and factorials and permutations, they're having to figure out between 500 and 1,000 things in 30 seconds. How long do they have between the time they get there before the ball has to be snapped? 40 seconds. The bottom line is they have to do a whole lot of thinking in a hurry without letting their thinking get in the way of their doing. Now, Yogi Berra said it best for me. Don't think you're hurting the team. Don't make me laugh here. Yogi was the smartest dumb guy I've ever met in my life. And the definition of the zone is when thinking is inversely proportionate to the stimulus of the environment. And what Max seems to have the capacity to do is do a whole lot of thinking, let the thinking go, and do the do, probably better than most kids with his experience. So that's what makes him exciting in a one-on-one workout with him, to watch his thinking and his doing match up. And one thing I can compliment him on, he can turn a workout intensity into almost game intensity. Like when he's throwing to his receivers in a practice, you can see the same basic intensity in a workout that you do in a game, which makes, when he goes between the lines in a real game, the transition is a little easier.
Yeah, Bill Belichick talks about that all the time. Practice execution is game reality. So if he's bringing that type of intensity to practice, you would think that that helps him on Sundays. Tom, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is related to a question that was posed to me by a reader a while ago, but you're the perfect person to ask. And I know everybody's different. Everybody's throwing motion is a little bit different. There are certain rules that I know you have to adhere by, but there's a lot of ways to get those rules accomplished and achieved. But you worked a lot with Drew Brees as well. And I know Mac Jones, I don't believe he was quite the level tennis player that Drew Brees was. My understanding Drew Brees was back when he was the younger athlete. But are there any similarities between those two as far as you can tell? Because Mac Jones had a similar sort of upbringing. His dad was a big tennis player. I know Mac Jones played a lot of tennis. Rotational athletes, right? We've heard you talk about that many times over the years. Any similarities from having seen both of these guys between what they do on a football field?
Okay, that is an astute observation, and I want to tell your audience that we did not talk about this before the podcast started. So this is coming out of your brain at real time. Athletes throw with their feet, and every athlete looks different doing the same thing. If you watch Drew Brees throw in his heyday, and you watch Mac Jones throw in his heyday, you're going to see a lot of common feet. Their stance is a little broader, a little wider than most, and they get into foot strike really quick. So they're going to be translating energy a little bit, and we'll use the GOAT himself. Tom Brady had a tendency to be too narrow, and his stride was too long, and that affected his timing. So it's, you have to have your feet work so you can be at the right place at the right time with the right sequence of events. And even though he looks a little different throwing than Drew Brees, if you look at their footwork, it's very similar. And going back to what I initially said, quarterbacks throw with their feet. Quick feet equal quick arm. Quick arm means you've got a chance to play.
It's great stuff, Tom. I think probably you'll have a lot of people now that are watching us or that are listening to us that are going to their computers or their phones, and they're going to start looking up video of Drew Brees and trying to match it side by side with Mac Jones, because all of this stuff is, I know, so interesting to them. So we thank you so much for spending so much time with us. We've been on for almost a half hour here, and it's just unbelievable every time we get the chance to spend some time with you. I appreciate it. I know our listeners appreciate it too. Thank you so much.
Right back at you, Phil. We'll do this anytime you want it, okay?
You're the best, man. Appreciate you.
Have a blessed day.
All right, great stuff there from Tom House. Again, always little nuggets from him. He's got a lot of wisdom. I don't know how else to describe it. I just really enjoy talking to him, because whether he's talking about Tom Brady fighting off old age and treachery with youthful exuberance, or whether he's talking about quarterback mechanics and he's making comparisons between Drew Brees and Mac Jones, there's so much that we can learn from him every time we talk to him. So we appreciate his time. And again, a lot of insight there about the kind of person and the kind of thrower that the Patriots have in their locker room in Mac Jones. I think what a lot of people are interested in, and you heard him talk about torque when we were watching that on the move throw from Mac Jones against the Raiders in that preseason game. Obviously, he's up on spin rate and velocity and all of those things. Tom House is seeing improvement from Mac Jones in those areas. I think for a lot of our listeners, they wonder, okay, but how will it look at the end of the season, right? Because of the way that the end of last season played out, where it did look like, whether you believe in the rookie wall or not, something happened to Mac Jones. I would assume that it would probably be due in part to exhaustion, given that you go right from your college season into your pre-draft prep to the Senior Bowl to the combine, working out constantly. Then you're competing for a starting job with a former MVP, trying to get your feet wet in the NFL. And then you have the longest season that you've ever had in terms of number of games played. It would stand to reason you get a little tired by the end of that deal. So for Tom House, he's not even just looking at, okay, how can we make sure that this is something that's maintained in terms of building up arm strength, maintained through a given season, but maintained and built upon over a period of years. You talk about Mac Jones and what he might be able to achieve into his 30s. That's a long way from now. But that's the kind of program that Tom House has him set on. I'm sure the Patriots training staff is looking long-term with this as well. And so whether it's in season, from this season to next season, those are the sort of constant improvements that they're going to be focused on making. And that's really where I think he may benefit the most, Mac Jones, is not necessarily driving the football from the opposite hash to the sideline to make a throw that maybe he wasn't able to make last year, but it's some of the off-platform stuff. It's some of the stuff later into the season. Is he able to fit it into a tighter window in late December than he was last year because of some of the work that he's done now, or some of the work that he's done over the summer out in San Diego with Tom House? So that's the stuff that will fascinate me, but you hear the optimism there from House, and I think Patriots fans should be optimistic as well. I did want to get to, because it is week one and because we do have a game finally to look ahead to. This is what all of this has been building towards. Off-season free agency, the draft, everything that we have been covering here so thoroughly at Next Pats. It all culminates with an actual football game this weekend, week one, Patriots, Dolphins. I'm fired up to see just how things look, because we've tracked how things have looked during training camp. I do think there will be a little bit of a shift in some ways. In some ways, I think it will be positive, because I think there will be more decision-making in Mac Jones's hands. We talked about that last week with Castle. In other ways, I'm not so sure how it's going to look. How is this offensive line, for instance, going to be able to handle the multiple blitz packages, the exotic looks that Josh Boyer and the Dolphins will throw at them? Because they did not see a lot of that in preseason, whether it was joint practices or preseason games. And it's still, even without the exotic looks, it still didn't look great up front in terms of the protection, in terms of being able to execute the blocks that they needed to in the running game. And so how does it look now when the reins are off and teams are willing to not be as vanilla as they were over the course of the summer? That will fascinate me. That's something that I'll be watching very closely, especially for somebody like Cole Strange. From UT Chattanooga to the NFL, it's a massive leap. They've tried to get him as many reps as they can, but he's somebody who very obviously still has plenty of ways in which he needs to grow to become the player that they want him to be, as would be expected for a rookie in his first week. But let's get to a couple of mailbag questions. We will have a written version of the mailbag that's on the website very soon, if not already by the time you're listening to this. And we'll do three quick ones. One from Puma Linen, one of our favorites on Twitter. He wants to know who has to have a great game for the Patriots to be able to defeat the Dolphins. Obviously, Mac Jones near the top of the list, but let's talk about someone else. Let's talk about a Miami returnee, Devontae Parker. I'm looking on the offensive side of the ball. Mac Jones is going to need to have someone who he can push the ball down the field to, because, again, if Miami, as I would expect, is going to be sending blitz after blitz after blitz, that should mean a lot of single high safety coverages, which should mean a lot of one-on-one on the outside. Now, Devontae Parker, not necessarily going to be running by anyone like Xavier Howard. We know Byron Jones will actually be out for this game, so we'll see who's opposite Howard on the boundary. But if it's one-on-one and Devontae Parker has a favorable matchup in terms of the size, I believe Mac Jones already has enough trust in him to be able to float the football down the field to him in 50-50 situations and trust him to make those plays. I think some of that trust has already been built up. And if he has time to make those throws, you'll see several of them. Now, if you hit on a few of those, then maybe that can soften up what Miami does defensively. Maybe they don't blitz as frequently. Maybe they start to show you some too high safety coverages, which then opens things up for your running game. So to me, on the offensive side of the ball, after Mac Jones, Devontae Parker, former Dolphin, really is the key player. And we're going to have to see him, I think, make significant contributions in week 1 for this offense to be performing at its optimal level. All right, Jake T. Hamilton's checking in. He says, essentially, could Jonathan Jones be CB1 instead of Jalen Mills? And then he asks, does it even matter given what the Patriots are going to be doing defensively? I think that second question is probably most apt, especially based on what we know about this Patriots defense right now, Jake. It's going to be a lot of zone, especially week 1 against the Dolphins. Now, can it be all zone? No, they will have to man up as well. And I think that's part of the reason why we will see Jonathan Jones start and play a lot on the outside in week 1. It's just the matchup for this specific week. You have 2 really undersized, but blazing fast, incredibly quick receivers in Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. Your best matchups for those players in those man-to-man situations are guys like Jonathan Jones. And maybe it's Miles Bryant in the slot on Jalen Waddle. Maybe it's Marcus Jones in the slot, who I think is probably the better athlete than Miles Bryant. And I would be interested to see if Bill Belichick would be willing to trust his third-round rookie in that way to start the season. It didn't look that way towards the end of the preseason. It was really a lot more Miles Bryant we saw with the ones than Marcus Jones. But who knows what happened over the course of the last 2 weeks out at Patriots practice. We're not out there anymore. And so maybe did Marcus Jones angle his way into the starting lineup to be that matchup against somebody like Waddle or Hill if those guys end up in the slot. So again, you will see occasional man-to-man matchups, but I think it's going to be a lot of zone. I think it's going to be a lot of too high safety coverages. They will encourage this Miami Dolphins team to run the football, because I think if there is a weakness on this Dolphins offense, and we will see what it looks like schematically, but it's essentially the Niners offense. We know where Mike McDaniel's come from. Their weakness is along the offensive line. And maybe they feel as though their front seven, the Patriots front seven, has some mismatches there. And if they can encourage Tua Tagovailoa to check out of pass plays because he sees too high safeties and check into runs, maybe the Patriots feel as though they can keep the score down. They can keep the score close that way. And then if it gets into a one-possession game in the final quarter, anything can happen. So I'm anticipating too high safeties, a lot of zone, and in the occasional situation where you end up in man, you'll see Jonathan Jones and probably Miles Bryant on Miami's 2 small, shifty, quick receivers. The reason I don't think, to answer your first question, Jonathan Jones will necessarily become the quote-unquote number 1 over the duration of the season, even though he does have great speed, is because his size is something that can be taken advantage of. We've seen it happen in the past with Jonathan Jones. Quarterbacks are willing to throw over the top, try to allow their receivers to pluck the football off Jonathan Jones's head. And he is scrappy. He's tough. He's competitive. He, I think, is very aware when the football is getting into his area, but there's only so much he can do at times because of his size. So whether it's next week, meaning week 2, ahead of seeing the Pittsburgh Steelers with guys like Chase Claypool and George Pickens on the outside, whether it's week 3 and you get into Rashad Bateman, who's not a massive man, but is somebody who has a little bit more size, there are going to be weeks where it's difficult for Jonathan Jones to match up with whoever the opposing number 1, quote unquote, number 1 is on the boundary. And so that's why I think Jalen Mills will probably be in that spot. The other reason is Mills has had a good summer. So if you've been following Next Pats or our written coverage on the website, I thought he was their MVP throughout the course of camp. I thought he was their best defensive player. The defensive side was obviously, to me, way ahead of the offensive side. And so he was probably the most impressive, and not just based on expectations, relative to expectations. He was the most impressive player for the Patriots this summer. Will that translate? We'll have to wait and see. I understand your trepidation about maybe having, as a Patriots fan, maybe having Jalen Mills as the number 1 corner, but that's how it looks for now. Let's do one more final question. Let's go to Ashley 1992 on Twitter. She says, who's going to be the starting offensive line this week? It's a great question, Ashley. As we're taping this, it's just before noon on Wednesday. The first injury report of the season comes out later this afternoon. I would anticipate that Isaiah Wynn is on there, starting right tackle, the presumed starting right tackle. If he can't go, or if he's at all limited in week one, in my opinion, it would be Yodny Kajust starting at right tackle. That's what we've seen. We saw it as early as the last time we were out at Patriots practice about a week ago. Yodny Kajust, who has dealt with injury himself. He suffered a little something that required him to get some extra attention after the Vegas Raiders preseason game, but he looked healthy. He looked like a full participant last time we were out at practice, even though it was just a smidgen of time that we were allowed out there. But that's, to me, who would be the right tackle fill-in for Wynn. So Trent Brown at left tackle, Cole Strange at left guard, David Andrews at center, Micah Wenu at right guard, and then either Wynn or Kajust at right tackle. That's what I anticipate the starting offensive line will be, and they will have a significant test on their hands down in South Florida. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to Next Pats this week. Enjoy the game this weekend. Hopefully enjoyed that conversation with Tom House. Please rate, comment, subscribe, tell your friends about the podcast. Try to grow this thing as much as we can as we go through the 2022 season. Fired up to finally have a game to talk about next week. We'll talk to you guys very soon.